Tonight on Primetime Politics, offensive statement.
These comments by this Liberal candidate may well rise to the level of criminal.
It is really scary to hear that. For those folks, it's really disturbing.
He's made those apologies. He's made them directly to the individual concerned. He's made them directly to me. He has my confidence.
Dozens of groups call on the Liberal leader to dump his candidate in the riding of Markham-Unionville after Paul Chiang says a Conservative rival could be turned over to Beijing to cash in on a bounty. Why is Mark Carney standing by this man? Is he failing to stand up against foreign interference? We'll get into that issue. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Mark Carney is standing by a Liberal candidate in a riding just north of Toronto, calling it a teachable moment. Now, that candidate is Paul Chiang. First elected in 2021, he is running again in the riding of Markham-Unionville. But back in January, Chiang told a Chinese language newspaper people could make money if they handed over Conservative rival Joe Tay to the Chinese consulate in Toronto. Tay helped co-found the pro-democracy Hong Konger station. He also runs a channel on YouTube. And late last year, Beijing issued a bounty on him for criticizing the PRC's crackdown of Hong Kong. 1 million Hong Kong dollars, or about 182,000 Canadian dollars, for information leading to Tay's arrest. Dozens of Hong Kong diaspora groups are calling on the Liberals to drop Chiang for that comment. But this is what we heard from the Liberal leader today.
Mr. Chiang is a veteran policeman with more than a quarter century of service to his community. 28 years of defending rights in this community, and he will continue with his candidacy going forward, having made those apologies very clearly to the individual, to the community, and moving forward to serve.
Mark Carney standing up for Paul Chiang. Now, we should note that Joe Tay is running for the Conservatives in another Toronto area riding in this election, this one in the city itself, Don Valley North. And take a listen to what we heard from the Conservative and NDP leaders reacting to Carney's response today.
Joe Tay is extremely afraid. He's afraid for his life. And I think he is probably rattled by the fact that the Prime Minister of Canada is siding with a Liberal MP who has made these horrific and dangerous comments against a Canadian citizen, against the life of a fellow Canadian citizen.
And to hear a candidate for the Liberal Party effectively say, go out and get the bounty on my opponent's head, it is really scary to hear that. For those folks, it's really disturbing. And for Mark Carney to say that I'm going to accept this candidate really sends a message that that type of commentary ultimately is acceptable, because he's not removing him as a candidate.
Well, for his thoughts on this issue, we're now joined by Marcus Kolga, Senior Fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. He is also one of 3 Canadians who have been sanctioned by both China and Russia for exposing oppression and intimidation. Mr. Kolga, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
So we just heard the Liberal leader standing by Mr. Chiang. You yourself have been sanctioned by China, the PRC, for writing about Chinese intimidation and diaspora groups. What's your reaction to the fact that Mr. Carney refuses to drop this candidate?
Well, it's extremely disappointing, and it's really a betrayal of democracy, transnational repression against Canadians, thousands of Canadians, of Chinese, Uyghur, Tibetan heritage, also human rights activists, is a very serious issue, one that was discussed for much of last year through the Hogue Commission, and in her final report, Madame Hogue clearly defined and made clear that transnational repression is a significant threat to our democracy. So to have the leader of the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister of Canada, sort of just dismiss Mr. Chiang's sort of participation almost in Chinese government transnational repression is deeply disappointing, and again, I think will make Canadians question the trust that they have in the Prime Minister and in our democracy.
Well, to your point, the NGO Hong Kong Watch, which is patroned by the last British governor of Hong Kong, is now asking the RCMP to investigate Mr. Chiang for potentially violating Canada's Foreign Interference and Security Information Act. Do you think this needs to be investigated as a potential violation of Canadian law?
Well, look, I mean, transnational repression is a serious concern. We have new legislation, Bill C-70, that was passed last year to try and deal with transnational repression. And so if there was any potential violation of that law or any others that are intended to protect Canadian citizens and our democracy, 100% they should be investigated. And the fact that Hong Kong Watch has issued this letter, that needs to be taken seriously by both the government and the RCMP and any other law enforcement units at any level of government that may be applicable.
Now, Mr. Carney is relatively new to politics, but his party has been criticized in the past for not reacting quickly or strongly enough to foreign interference. By defending Mr. Chiang, are Liberals right now living up to that reputation?
Well, I think, unfortunately, so. I mean, this is a clear case of a dismissal of a case of transnational repression. Whether Mr. Chiang was joking or not in suggesting that Canadians should take someone who was potentially going to be a political opponent to one of either the Chinese consulate or one of these Chinese government police stations in Canada to collect a bounty, it's neither funny. It's a very serious sort of suggestion to make, and so, like I said, if there's any suggestion that he may have violated Canadian laws in doing so, those need to be investigated.
Okay. Now you say that this is serious, and so I want to pick up on that point because I wonder what you think, or perhaps even fear, the impact of this decision to stand with Mr. Chiang will have on diaspora groups in this country.
Well, look, the clip earlier clearly outlined Mr. Chiang's own background. He's was a member of the York Region Police Force for 28 years. He was a member of Parliament and a parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Immigration. That he has a moral obligation to defend all Canadians, whether it's part of diaspora minority groups, whether it's human rights activists. That is a trust that we have bestowed in that individual. He has clearly broken that trust. And I think that diaspora communities, other Canadians who are vulnerable to transnational repression, this is going to send a chill throughout those communities. Again, it's a question of trust and trusting our government, our elected members of Parliament, to defend them. When they start essentially collaborating with a foreign authoritarian regime in their efforts to try and intimidate and silence critics and opponents of that regime, that's a very, very serious concern. And that is, quite frankly, a threat to the integrity of our democracy and, again, the trust that we place in our elected officials.
Okay, you use the term moral obligation. Does Mr. Chiang have the moral obligation to resign, pull out of this race? And if not, does Mr. Carney have the moral obligation to get rid of this candidate?
I think Mr. Carney, as the Prime Minister of Canada, as the leader of the Liberal Party, has a moral obligation. His party has a moral obligation to remove this individual as a candidate. It's entirely up to Mr. Chiang himself what he decides to do, but certainly the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party do have a moral obligation to act, and to act immediately.
Now, you live in the riding where that Mr. Chiang actually represents, Mr. Kolga. What's been the reaction to this around you in your own neighborhood?
Well, look, I don't think that Mr. Chiang himself is all that well known even within the riding. I think, talking to neighbors, they'd be hard pressed to identify who the member of Parliament, quite frankly, is. And so, the reaction that I'm hearing specifically from members of the Hong Kong, Tibetan, and Uyghur communities, including those that live within the riding, is of deep concern and deep disappointment, not just in Mr. Chiang's comments, but the fact that Mr. Carney himself has not reacted, has not removed Mr. Chiang yet. And so like I said, there's very deep concern amongst those, specifically those communities who are impacted by transnational repression right here in the riding. And I'd have to say myself, as a human rights activist, someone who has been targeted by both Russia and China, it's deeply concerning for me. I don't feel like I would feel comfortable being in the same room with Mr. Chiang at this point, or being anywhere near him, given his remarks, because again, we don't know whether he was joking or serious. And so if we're unsure of that, and his proximity to the Chinese government, it's again a very, very deep concern for all of us.
Marcus Kolga, I appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
Well, despite the controversy surrounding the Liberal candidate in Markham-Unionville, the party itself under Mark Carney continues to build on its lead in the polls, with the numbers indicating if current trends hold, well, the Liberals will not only get a historic fourth term, but also its first majority win since 2015. Polls analyst Éric Grenier is the founder and the writer behind The Writ. He joins us right now in studio. Éric, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so as I said, the momentum for the Liberals seems to keep going on. Let's start with the latest numbers. What are you finding right now?
Yeah, there was 3 polls that came out this morning. We're now at the state of the race where we're getting 3 daily trackers. And what's interesting about these is that they're all done differently. So we're getting a look at different methodologies. But across those 3 tracking polls, we do see that the Liberals are in a very strong position, anywhere between 43–44% support. The Conservatives are also pretty steady, around 36 to 40%, depending on the poll. And the NDP has been between around 6 and 11%. And we've started to see these numbers really get locked in, I'd say, over the last few days. Where increasingly we are seeing these polls for the Liberals where they're just a tick over 40%. We're seeing these polls with the Conservatives do seem to be stuck somewhere around that 38% mark, which historically has been enough to win a majority government, or at least a government, but not this time. And the NDP being in those high single digits to low teens. And we'll see if anything's going to move those numbers, but so far the trend line has actually been pretty steady since the beginning.
Okay, steady. Although obviously the Liberals are finding new pockets of support, and I'm wondering where that is, because we began this campaign knowing that the Liberals were making headway in Atlantic Canada, making headway in Quebec. Where are they now gaining support to lift their numbers to such high levels?
I think one of the places that is perhaps the most surprising is in British Columbia. We know that the Liberals have that solid base in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, and the Ontario numbers are looking pretty similar to what they've had in the last few elections. But in British Columbia, they are now leading in the polls. It is about a 2-point race between the Liberals and the Conservatives in my polling averages. The NDP is much further back. And when we see this kind of movement, where the Liberals have increased their share of the vote by a significant amount, the NDP has lost over half of their vote. There's just a lot of seats that are going to swing, particularly in the Lower Mainland, perhaps on Vancouver Island. Conservatives are going to pick up some of those seats, and the Liberals will pick up a lot of them as well. And we just could have an entirely new map in British Columbia that might look a lot like the map we saw in the provincial election last fall, but just replacing that NDP orange with some federal Liberal red.
Okay, and we know that was a close race provincially, so something we're watching. But how much of this is about leadership? And when I ask that, I am wondering, when you look at the polling numbers, what are Canadians saying about the various party leaders?
That is perhaps what is most startling, I guess, from someone who's looking at the numbers this closely, is that we're seeing that at the national level, the gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives isn't huge. We're talking at most usually 4 or 5 points. But when it comes to leadership, you see that Mark Carney is usually polling well ahead of Pierre Poilievre on preferred prime minister by wider margin than the Liberals are preferred over the Conservatives. And we also see that on issues like handling Donald Trump, on just issues related to the economy, that Carney is beating Pierre Poilievre by a big margin. And what that tells me is that the big shift that we've seen, the big surge in support for the Liberals, is getting increasingly, the structure underneath it is getting more solid. We were wondering at the beginning of the campaign whether the Liberals were vulnerable to slide back. But with the kind of leadership numbers we see with Mark Carney, if anything, he is pushing them up. And you could argue that Pierre Poilievre is actually dragging the Conservatives down right now.
Okay, but if Mark Carney is pushing them up, ultimately we're talking about a man that had no political experience before winning the Liberal leadership and now in the midst of this campaign. Is there a danger of hitting this high mark too early in the campaign? This is only day 9, and there's still weeks to go in this.
I think there should be that kind of danger for the Liberals because, as you said, they still got a long ways to go. And I think at the beginning of the race, when Mark Carney was starting to crest that the Liberals were starting to get more support in the polls, a lot of Canadians were looking at him saying, okay, who is this guy? What do I think of him? But they were still seeing Pierre Poilievre as the Prime Minister in waiting, who was supposed to be the one who would win the election. Now I think as it increasingly becomes clear to Canadians, and we're starting to see that in polls that they see it as well, that the Liberals could get reelected, I think the focus might be more on Mark Carney and the Liberals, which means that the stakes are higher, the risks are greater if anything goes bad. But so far, we're not seeing any indication of that. The polling numbers for the Liberals have been holding steady in Quebec, which is one place where it was thought that maybe he was having some issues. So far, there's no signs of danger for the Liberals. So it's more about if something unexpected happens on the campaign between now and April 28th, that is their biggest risk. But in the underlying data, it's hard to see that there is a serious vulnerability for the Liberals.
Okay, you know, we're quickly running out of time, but I do want to ask about Quebec since you raised it, because, you know, a few months ago, we were talking about the possibility of a Bloc Québécois official opposition, which seems not to be on the table anymore. What's the situation like in Quebec right now?
Yeah, it's really dynamic right now. We're seeing that the Bloc has fallen quite a bit, and increasingly we're starting to see polls where the Bloc is in 3rd place, because the Conservative vote has actually been holding up pretty steady throughout the campaign and over the last few months in Quebec. So as we see more of that Bloc vote go over to the Liberals, it just increases the map for the Liberals across Quebec, particularly in Francophone Quebec outside of the Greater Montreal area. And it also opens up possibility for the Conservatives, because as the Bloc comes down, there are a handful of ridings where the Conservatives are that second choice. So we could see quite a bit of change in Quebec. And with where things are heading right now for the Bloc Québécois, it's looking more like they could be down into the teens in seats rather than in the 30s or 40s.
So teens in seats, and the NDP struggling with official party status.
Yeah, so it is increasingly looking like a two-party race, and that is a race that right now favors the Liberals.
Okay, well, we can keep tracking it with you, so thank you for that, Éric Grenier.
All right, thanks.
Well, just as Donald Trump and his policies are having an impact on the 45th general election, they're also having an impact on Canada's defense policy, in particular leading Canadians to debate the future of the F-35 program. Chosen back in 2010 by the Harper government and again in 2023 by the Trudeau government, the F-35 was described as the best choice for the Royal Canadian Air Force. But recent tensions with the United States is raising doubts about that assessment. It's an issue that I discussed earlier today with retired Lieutenant-General Yvan Blondin. Now, you were part of the team that recommended that Canada purchase and participate in the F-35 program, but now you say the situation has changed. In fact, you say it would be irresponsible for this country to go forward with the F-35 without a serious rethink of what Canada's defense posture should be. What do you mean by that?
Well, you're right. I was part of the decision-making process. I was commander of the Air Force from 2012 to 2015, recommending to Prime Minister Harper at the time that we get the F-35. That was the best airplane at the time, by far. Today, with the change of situations we've seen in the last 3 months, I'm not saying we need to cancel the F-35. I'm saying that we need to reconsider basing the decision to build the future fighter force for Canada based solely on the F-35.
And that has everything to do with what? Donald Trump expressing concerns or doubts about NATO, about not being the security guarantee for Ukraine. What is it that you point to that necessitates this kind of rethink?
Well, you mean about the F-35 or about the next generation of airplanes?
Well, I think in terms of what's behind this rethink, if you're saying that Canada's defense posture has to be rethought rather, it seems that a lot of this is tied to what we're hearing from the U.S. president as well.
Absolutely. It's about what we hear about the U.S. in general. The F-35 is not different than all the other military decisions that we have made in the last 40 years under NATO. Everything was based on deterrence, and deterrence was about rearming, and rearming was mostly about getting American weapons. Now, all our weapons are American-made, especially in Canada, and we depend on the Americans to sustain it. F-35 is probably the latest, the most advanced, but probably the most the one that relied the most on the U.S. The software that controls all those computers. We knew it's an issue if you sell it to many countries, and the F-35 program is about selling it to 7 allies, close allies, but then to sell it to many other countries. All those countries would have access to that software, and it needs to be controlled. We agreed early on in the program that we will limit the access to this software and give it solely to the U.S., which is great if the U.S. is your best ally. As soon as the U.S. pulls out of this situation, doesn't share the same values, and now decisions are not necessarily made the same way we thought they would be made, it is a risk. They control the software of your airplanes. It doesn't mean they're going to do something, but if you're going to be buying airplanes that will be your defense for your sovereignty for the next 40 years, you don't want somebody else that you do not trust to be able to control your software and make decisions on supplies, on spare parts, and at worst, on controlling your software or shutting it down. And there's always the possibility that in 2 years or 4 years, with a new election in the U.S., that the pendulum goes back on the other side. And there's a Democrat government being elected, and things come back somewhat to normal. But there's still going to be this polarization in the States, and having a Democrat government next doesn't guarantee that the pendulum is not going to swing back and the other way, and the problem will reoccur in the future. So what I'm saying is that this risk with the F-35 is real. It's not necessarily that high right now, but I would not base the next 40 years of defense on solely the F-35 with this risk.
And our thanks to retired Lieutenant General Yvan Blondin. Well, we're now into day 9 of this election campaign, and it did kick off early this morning with Pierre Poilievre promising to create a national energy corridor if Conservatives form the next government. This corridor would allow, theoretically, for the building of railways, pipelines, and transmission lines, creating an east-west link to break the reliance on American trade.
Here's how it would work. First, we would use the model of the shovel-ready zone. That is to say, the permits would be pre-authorized. After consultations and environmental research, we would find the path that is safe for our citizens and for nature. Second, we would consult with First Nations, as is our duty under the Constitution of Canada. Third, we would lock down the permits, and we would publish specifications and standards that companies have to meet so that they would do the projects in a responsible way that keeps everyone safe. Then the permits would be pre-published online and legally binding. In other words, the government would not have the legal right to reverse course and change its mind.
As for the Liberal leader, Mark Carney said a Liberal government would get back into the business of building affordable housing, partnering with the private sector with a newly proposed entity that would be known as Build Canada Homes. That agency, part of a larger housing plan the Liberals say could double the current rate of residential construction to 500,000 new homes each year.
The way we build homes needs to change. Prefabricated and modular housing will play a big role in the future. They can drive down the time to completion by up to 50%. They're cheaper to build by up to 20%. And they're a more sustainable way to build, producing 22% fewer emissions than traditional construction methods. And the good news is we're already home to many new prefabricated housing factories. We want Canada to be the world leader in this new innovative industry. We should be that leader. That's why we're providing $25 billion in financing to scale up that industry.
And finally, the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says his party would end subsidies to the oil and gas industry, redirecting that money towards retrofitting homes across the country. renovations that the party says would make those homes energy efficient, more cost efficient, and also more environmentally friendly.
So our plan would help 3.3 million homes get retrofitted. We would support low-income families with free upgrades, free retrofits to their homes, and then the remaining would be loans and grants to help higher-income families. Over 10 years, our plan is to get 3.3 million homes retrofitted, lowering their costs, lowering their emissions, helping families out. And what are the other plans, though, from the other parties? Well, Mark Carney still believes in giving away your hard-earned public money to highly profitable oil and gas companies. He would continue to do that in his plan, and that is wrong. Pierre Poilievre's plan is to let big polluters pay to pollute as much as they want. He wants to eliminate entirely any barriers, any limits to how much they pollute. That means unlimited pollution into the land, water, into the air. That is clearly the wrong plan. Our plan is about taking away from the highly profitable oil and gas companies and giving to everyday people, to helping out families. And that's why New Democrats are in it for you. That's why our plan is one that's always going to be in it for you.
So just some of the promises we heard on this day 9 of the campaign. We also want to note, though, that both the NDP and Conservative leaders were asked about the state of their campaigns this morning, asked whether it's time for their respective war rooms to rethink their strategies. We're going to dig deeper into that issue tomorrow with our campaign strategists. Well, before we go tonight, we also want to share with you an election series. CPAC has deployed journalists right across the country to give us a closer look at some key ridings in this campaign. Lucy Van Olden-Barneveld is in the Maritimes right now for us, and she filed this report on the riding of South Shore St. Margaret's in Nova Scotia.
South Shore St. Margaret's is a huge riding, one of the largest in Nova Scotia. And it starts just beyond the border of Halifax and encompasses the entire South Shore. So a big issue, obviously, in this area is the fishery. This riding accounts for 2/3 of Nova Scotia's billion-dollar lobster export. So this is on people's minds. Tariffs coming from the United States. Will they be implemented here on lobster? And of course, China has already implemented a 25% tariff on seafood. So this is a big concern to people. There's also a Michelin tire plant here that employs 2,000 people. So if tariffs are a go here, that will affect people's jobs. It'll affect their livelihoods. So affordability and the economy is huge here. But beyond that, so is this sense of unease, a sense of insecurity and anxiety that seems to be, people are feeling it here, but across the country. What is going to happen from our huge neighbor to the south? So that really is affecting people's ballot question, what they're going to do on April the 28th. Now, the candidates here are, they're the progressive conservative, or the conservative incumbent, Rick Perkins. He has been the MP since 2021, and he won by a narrow margin against the former Liberal Fisheries Minister. Now, the Liberal candidate this time is a woman by the name of Jessica Fancy Laundrie. She is a new candidate. She has been knocking on doors since October. She is an educator. So as of now, there is no NDP candidate. There's also a Green Party candidate who hasn't traditionally been much of a factor here. So without an NDP candidate, this could help the fortunes of the Liberal candidate here. So we'll see what happens, obviously, on the 28th. But one thing is for sure, it's going to be another close election. For CPAC, I'm Lucy Van Olden-Barneveld here in Mahone Bay.
Lucy, thank you for that. And you can see more from Lucy as her detailed look at the riding will start airing tomorrow. It's part of our Campaign Politics series. You can catch it on all our CPAC platforms. And as for Primetime Politics, that is our program for this day 9 of the campaign. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll see you again tomorrow.